Can't get through a discussion about the weaponization of government, what's going awry in our government, without talking about technology, right? Technology has become omnipresent, right? It's everywhere. My generation is so different than my kids, and I actually have grandkids at this point. The way they're growing up, the pervasiveness of technology can be good, right? Technology can do good things, but it can also do a lot of evil things. And it's sometimes hard to keep up with the volume and the speed and veracity of what's happening here. But we're going to talk a little bit about technology. So please help me welcome to the stage Kara Frederick, who's the director of Tech Policy of the Tech Policy Center for the Heritage Foundation. Ben Weingarten, who's don't worry about the association with the name there. Ben is the editor-at-large at Real Clear Investigations, and Michael Benz, executive director, the Foundation for Freedom Online. Thank you all for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Kara.
All right, thank you, sir. Hey, it's great to see everyone today, especially you ladies. Thanks for coming. Appreciate the moms in the audience. As a new mom myself, I feel like we all need to stick together no matter what, especially when it comes to tech. So I'm going to jump right in. No long preludes or anything like that. But I'm looking at you. But Mike, I want to direct my first question to you because it's not an elephant in the room or anything. But when you came to, I would say, fame, it was after Tucker. You talked with Tucker, and you just exploded on X. Elon Musk picked you up. Everyone knew about you. Everyone saw your handsome face. Can you tell us why people were paying attention to you? Can you distill your argument that was so compelling to everyone?
Yeah, thank you, Kara, and thanks both to your work, to Heritage for hosting this, Ben for his incredible work. I think the fundamental thesis of what I was laying out on the Tucker Carlson interview was that what we're up against here are not, pink-haired, ambigendered, LGBT, BLM, maximizing, identitarian politics when we're talking about censorship on the internet or climate, control. There's something a much larger force than the simple partisan politics that censorship manifests itself as, and that is the blob. It's the foreign policy establishment. And folks who are conservative, who tend to come from a populist or nationalist perspective, look at things happening in the American homeland from the power perspective of the homeland. They don't think about the American empire. They don't think about the managers of the American empire, which is our foreign policy establishment, our State Department, our Pentagon, our intelligence services, and the corporate and financial donors and drafters off of that. And when you go upstream to internet censorship and what's driving it, both here and all across NATO, and even in Brazil with what's happening this week, you will find that foreign policy establishment power structure, which is a much bigger, thicker, much more cold calculating, and much more well-resourced threat than a simple partisan fight.
I love that, especially because conservatives, as our fearless leader, Dr. Roberts, is fond of saying, he's a recovering neocon, right? And myself included, right? I went to Afghanistan 3 times. I fought in service of the blob, what I thought was for noble purposes, as a civilian intelligence officer, that is. But Ben, I think this comes to your work because we were counterterrorism analysts, again, working in the service of those guys. And you identified something very, very early along the lines of what Mike did. And you found that these national security excuses, these, the apparatus of counterterrorism tools, they were being repurposed toward policing speech, and especially used hand in glove with the government and big tech to do so against heterodox conservative thinkers, what we would call dissidents today. Why were you so early to that, to the argument that Michael is making? What did you see that nobody else saw?
Well, that's kind, and maybe a little bit too kind. But what I would say is this: it's worth noting that the tip of the spear, the leading edge of all of the attacks on Donald Trump as an avatar for tens of millions of dissenting Americans, came from the national security, intelligence, foreign policy apparatus. Why was he so universally hated? Obviously by the administrative state, because he threatened to upset the apple cart. But the deep state is the deepest part, obviously, of the administrative state, which felt most threatened by the idea that he would upend the foreign policy blob, uniparty foreign policy blob. At the same time, you had the national security, intelligence, law enforcement apparatus pursuing Trump from Russiagate onward. You also had the tech companies identify that what happened in 2016 could never happen again. And that's Brexit, which Mike has talked about at length, as well as obviously Trump winning. That's the catastrophe. That they didn't articulate it that way, but that was the catastrophe from their perspective. And so they kind of used the pretext of Russian dis, and malinformation, grafting a Cold War sort of paradigm on Americans, essentially, as we are now the enemy that's engaging in wrongthink, which threatens to upend our regime. And by our regime, I mean the orthodoxy of our sort of uniparty establishment. And so the big tech platforms themselves were viewed as a key weakness in controlling the narrative to monopolize power. You can't have these dissenting ideas and a populist nationalist revolution that leads to someone who's going to upend our apple cart. And so consequently, these big tech platforms became perceived as, rather than vehicles for free and open discourse, which, as Mike has spoken to, were powerful tools for American soft power abroad in a positive sense. Now they needed to be weaponized as assets of the security state, essentially. And so this is sort of how you get from a Russian dis and malinformation leads to, oh my God, dissenters in this country actually have representatives, to we're going to use that dis and malinformation as a justification to say this is a danger to our institutions, so-called, and our democracy, which is to say the power of the establishment. And we're going to recharacterize that dissent as a danger. And then, of course, when you have a January 6th that you can use as a catalyzing event to say, you see, these are domestic terrorists or would-be domestic terrorists, or they're inciters, aiders, abettors, and enablers, that's how you get to a national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, which might be the most disturbing document the Biden administration has put out that no one speaks about, which talks about confronting the long-term contributors to domestic terror. And I have the quote, and I can read it later, but essentially it's, you can't have an information environment that enables what we saw essentially on January 6th, and it codifies a war on wrongthink in this country.
And that is what I want the audience to take away from this session. We surfaced it when, I think it was back in February 2022, when DHS had a terrorism bulletin. And they basically said that misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, as you say, about COVID-19 or the vaccine was tantamount to terrorist activity. A DHS terrorism bulletin. And who were the ones, talking about COVID-19? They were heterodox thinkers. They were conservatives. They were people largely on the right. So that, I think, should trigger everybody's alarm bells, because the government, when they talk about specific authorities like CT authorities, that means something. It means something very different from just, live and let live. They can talk, but they're wackos or conspiracy theorists.
Well, just really quick, and Mike can jump in at any time, it's worth noting that your fellow CT officers migrated into the trust and safety content moderation teams within the social media platform. So there is a revolving door between those. And of course, the justification was, well, look, terrorists are using these platforms, obviously, to do us ill. But obviously, that's used as a pretext, just like if you look at DHS, what was DHS's original charge to go after jihadists essentially overseas? Ultimately, there's mission creep, and it goes to domestic dissenters who threaten our political power.
I feel impugned by that, having gone from CT apparatus to Facebook, but you're right. You're right. And Mike, can you talk more specifically about what that looks like in practice?
Yeah, well, part of the issue is we're actually past that now. That was, as Ben said, how the initial predicate was laid down. This is something that I refer to as the foreign to domestic switcheroo. The initial censorship structure in this country grew out of what was called the hybrid warfare doctrine that NATO came up with after the Crimea annexation. And there was essentially a pan-military decision across NATO for the military to play a more active role in the media, because they perceived a loss of hearts and minds in Eastern Europe as us ceding ground to Russia politically. And then when Brexit and the Trump election happened, the Russiagate predicate was used to basically portray any sort of right-wing populism as being favorable for Russia, and then so could be censored on the basis of being Russian propaganda. The problem was when Russiagate died in the summer of 2019, when Mueller choked on the stand in the hearing, they, instead of shutting down that censorship apparatus that joined together the FBI and the CIA and DOD and State Department, they simply changed the predicate from being a Russiagate predicate to a democracy predicate. And this is very nasty because democracy is the watchword of the foreign policy establishment to overthrow governments. I'm just going to say that again. Democracy is the watchword of the foreign policy establishment to overthrow governments. So we have had a lot of presidents, Republican presidents, who have been tarred by left-wing media as being, bad people, dictators. People were calling George Bush a Nazi and things like that. I remember in my lifetime, they were not calling him a threat to democracy. That triggers when something is categorized as a threat to democracy by our government. What that does, it's like an immune system response that activates for the white blood cells of our blob to descend the NGO swarm, the university centers, which act as proxies by the government, are all funded by our federal government, for DOD counterintelligence, for the State Department to get involved, for the FBI, for DHS, they all descend on it. And they use their media organs as well. Much of what we think about as being independent media is anything but. They depend, and we can go through this in more detail maybe in questions, but this surround sound is a creation of this immune system, and the fact that it no longer, even though it was created under this foreign policy national security predicate, we are now about 4 or 5 years past that. And I'll give you just one great example to leave this off on. The number one funder right now of the censorship industry in the U.S., and not the number one necessarily most, top of the food chain, but who's providing the actual money, the civil society capacity building for domestic censorship mercenary firms, is the National Science Foundation, which is basically the kissing cousin of DARPA. And National Science Foundation is the number one. It's the number one funder of all secondary research in the U.S. $10 billion goes to our universities, the National Science Foundation. They created a program which used a democracy. They created 2 programs actually during the Biden administration, which simply said misinformation is a threat to democracy, and so they've given over $60 million just in the past year to specially constructed censorship labs, they call them, counter-misinformation labs within universities. It's now a growing profession where undergraduates and PhD students are staking their professional careers on the rise of the censorship industry. And it's all constructed around a democracy predicate, which again simply means the control and the ability to overthrow a government who's not doing the bidding of the U.S. foreign policy establishment.
That's fascinating. And speaking of democracy, I'll ask both of you, what's in store for 2024? What are we not guarding against? What's happening that we're not seeing? And how do we contest it?
Well, a couple points, and I'm sure Mike will amplify at least one of them because he's done some research on it. To me, there are a few factors you can see already kind of bubbling up and coalescing. And by the way, there are elections happening all over the world that may serve as precursors to what we see here in terms of the way the censorship apparatus ratchets up. One thing is, and Brazil is a perfect example of this, a notion of that there's going to be another foreign to domestic switcheroo vis-a-vis regulatory regimes around wrongthink that the EU and other governments are imposing, which will essentially end up censoring us here at home. So that the hate speech regulations and such that you see the EU imposing and the massive fines associated with them to the companies, that in and of itself may well end up chilling and ultimately purging American speech under the banner of the foreign regulations. Then you've also seen there's somewhat of a commotion around this Pennsylvania election task force, which they're standing up in partnership with, among others, CISA, which is the DHS sub-agency, which is the nerve center of federal government-led speech policing, the heart of this censorship apparatus that built up prior to 2020. They have a task force dedicated to purging election misdis and malinformation. And I imagine, and if you look, there are a couple of other states that are also already, they have outsourced contracts to third parties that are also surveilling social media for wrongthink around elections. Remember, wrongthink around elections was the key sort of focus going into 2020. If you had questions about the integrity of mail-in balloting or a whole slew of other processes, all of the social media companies, at the behest of the government and then government cutouts, essentially changed their terms of service to say these are threats to democracy effectively, and you need to purge wrongthink, while there were debates being had within state legislatures about the policies that were being put forward. So in real time, censoring people as the sausage was being made policy-wise. And then so you have the state level issue, and maybe they'll go with the states this time, not the feds, who are going to be coordinating and organizing. And then you have the federal government. And then beyond that, you can already see there's a moral panic that's being blown. And it's not to say that there couldn't be legitimate misuses, obviously, of generative AI, but that's a huge buzzword. And if you look at what CISA and others are talking about, they're talking about generative AI, and they're talking about threats to election officials. They continue to hype up and inflate the notion of, well, if you want to actually be able to watch what's going on at the polls, that's a domestic terror threat. And then you also have this notion of generative AI. If you're looking at what they're going to use as a pretext, will there be one catalyzing event or a cascade of events that will be used to engage the censorship apparatus in 2024? I guess stay tuned on that. But last but not least, I think nuking X would be the ultimate goal for them. And if they don't get to nuking X, at the very least, they're going to raise the cost to the maximum extent for Elon Musk going in. Although, as Mike will tell you, he has unique leverage over the government because the government is so reliant on his companies. That makes it a little bit more difficult for them. But I do think in their dream world, we'd be in a world where Rumble wouldn't exist, X wouldn't exist. At minimum, they are jettisoned from app stores, and that means silencing tens of millions of people.
Mike, what does the Censorship Industrial Complex have planned for the presidential election in 2024?
Yeah, I think Ben's summary is actually very good, and it's actually what censorship industry insiders say in their own words. So, a couple months ago, some of the most important thought leaders in the censorship industry held a symposium, not unlike this actually, and then published a 150-page white paper at the end of it. And the top-level theme was panic responsibly, because there's 85 elections around the world, and we've lost Twitter. And the House, Judiciary Committee and Weaponization Committee is issuing all these subpoenas against us and bringing us in for transcribed interviews. And there are now these lawsuits between the Supreme Court case, Missouri v. Biden, and the America First legal case. And basically, they said we took our first L in the past 7 years. They'd win after win from 2016 through 2023, and then last year, because of the House turning over, and because the censorship issue being taken seriously, and because of the national awareness around this, and because of the turnover, the corporate regime change at X, so to speak, there has been actually a blossoming of free speech on the internet, and they are panicked. And literally, their quote was "panic responsibly," because we have two tricks up our sleeve still. And they said we would be in full panic, but for two things. And the first thing that they said, and Ben touched on this, was something called the EU Digital Services Act. And I would caution you not to think in your mind that of the bland, blasé name EU Digital Services Act. This is the NATO censorship law. Okay, this is what it is. It's the NATO censorship law. The EU is basically the commercial arm of NATO. NATO wants to stop the rise of populist parties in the U.S. and all across NATO, in the U.K., in France, in Italy, in Spain, in Greece, in everywhere that there's an election this year and there's a populist party on the ballot, whether that's from the right or the left. They went after Jeremy Corbyn for being left-wing anti-NATO. It's just that left-wing populists have not had as much electoral success and don't pose as much of a threat there. But this NATO censorship law is very nasty because what it does is it goes beyond the simple hate speech laws that Europe have, and it imposes a new standard about disinformation. So it's creating a new industry for disinformation compliance. Now, the EU is a larger market than the United States. There's 550 million people in the EU. You cannot be a multinational tech platform without having access to the EU market. U.S. companies operating in Europe are going to have to cooperate with this disinformation law. Now, we know the people behind this are the same people who constructed the election censorship apparatus in 2020. So, for example, NewsGuard has partnered with the EU for doing the rules making on this. NewsGuard has also partnered with the American Federation of Teachers, and they are bringing in a new program called Media Literacy, which is all across schools now. It's actually state mandated in California, New York, Illinois, Rhode Island, and several other states. They have a plan to put this mandatory sense. And media literacy just means if you read the wrong media sources, you are illiterate. It doesn't mean teaching you how to read. It literally says if you watch, for example, this symposium on social media, you've committed effectively a mental thought crime. You are illiterate in the news sources you read, and you need to get your mind right. You need to be re-educated, and you will get docked in schools if you cite the wrong sources. For example, structuring is sort of like Wikipedia does. Wikipedia does not allow basically any sort of conservative or populist citation because it's blacklisted. So they basically cited two things. They said, thankfully, this new NATO censorship law is going to force, no matter what Elon wants to do, he's going to have to play ball. He's going to have to play ball with this new law, and he's going to have to put in place the censorship measures that NATO rolls out around election disinformation. So no matter what, he's going to have to play ball with us. But we're still waiting for the final rules on that. The law has been passed. It will come into effect before 2024. It's hard to pierce in advance of that. And then the second thing that they cited was the role of states, and that's both on state election disinformation censorship through the state secretary of state's offices, which are a major Soros project, I should add, and then also through these new state mandated laws around media literacy.
So here's the thing, though. We know this. We know this is happening. We know it's happened with CISA. We know it's happened with a cybersecurity organization by the state in California when Twitter used to be the old Twitter. So how, our lawmakers, our policymakers, they have had 3 years to figure out how to contend with this issue. You have your subpoenas, you have your blustering, you have your theater. How come nothing's been done yet? Is it you go to the government, or you go to the big tech companies themselves and look at what they're doing and start to target them? What do you do? How come nothing's been done? And how do we fix this?
Okay. So the first thing is it is worth noting that it's not. I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as nothing's been done, because what has been done already at the legislative level has been phenomenal in creating a freezing effect. In fact, the New York Times did a basically apoplectic screeching as their A1 lead article of the Sunday edition about 2 weeks ago, where they said that basically Trump allies are winning the war on disinformation. Actually cited me by name 24 times in the article. How did we lose that? How are we, how are we losing on, on all these fronts? And a lot of this has been because of things like the open air hearings, the subpoenas, the transcribed interviews that are necessary. And that have been done. Jim Jordan, has subpoenaed the Stanford Internet Observatory, brought them all in for interviews, did 3 hearings on it. Dan Bishop in the House Homeland Security Committee, which is the oversight of DHS and the CISA censorship agency, did the same thing. 2 hearings on it. Played their clips on the congressional jumbotron. Wave of news cycles, waves of subpoenas, having to turn over all these documents, turning over all this very scandalizing activity. And they complained in the New York Times and in the Washington Post and in Science and a dozen other magazines that political support is crumbling. But the issue is the money still flows. And this is really where I think gets to the heart of your question. And I'll just end this with one anecdote here. I've had the privilege to be able to brief many sitting members of Congress on this issue. And I did a talk to about 15 sitting members of the House about two or 3 months ago. And I was very troubled by one of the remarks of a member after that, which one of them came up to me afterwards and said, "Benz, listen, totally agree with what you're saying. I've been reading everything you're writing on this. I have to tell you, I agree CISA is a terrible agency. What they did is completely abominable. It's totally a violation of the First Amendment. But I have to let you know, I voted to support funding for CISA. I gave them every penny of what they asked for in the new appropriations bill because we were under pressure from House leadership. And this gets to something really dark, which is the Republican Party able to challenge from the inside the blob faction of the GOP, which appears to control party leadership, because you have so many good junior members and so many good, even sort of mid-level folks at the House power structure, but they seem impotent to be able to go up against the heads of the party. And now at this point, this now comes down to a Mike Johnson issue. At the time, it was it was another. But what I'll say is, Mayorkas, the head of DHS, even tweeted publicly. He said, "You want to tell us, Congress? We know what you'll value Congress by what you fund. At the end of the day, all your talk means nothing unless it comes down to what you fund us." He told us that it all comes down to whether you fund it or not. And the censorship industry, the reason I use that phrase, censorship industry, is because at the end of the day, it is an industry. It is a profession with hundreds of thousands of people. And by the way, mark my words, it will be millions of people employed in this industry with these new media literacy laws, which creates mandatory censorship laws in this jobs in this country. If there's no money, there's no jobs, and there's no capacity. So you cut the money off. So we need to get the House together and say, cut the funding to every single one of these institutions within our government that's behind this.
Yeah. So what I would say is the baseline, and we're still going to have a lot of problems even if we get to the baseline, but the baseline should be not a single penny of taxpayer dollars should go towards silencing ourselves. That's at the federal level, and that's also at the state level. You're still going to have this outside apparatus that Mike is speaking to, but to the extent you don't have government funding fueling the creation of this industry and then compliance officers that every company under the sun is going to have to hire to be able to comport their practices with the draconian regime that's imposed upon them. But nevertheless, cutting off the federal funding and the direction from the feds and state governments as well is absolutely imperative. Now, that's not to say that there has not been success, because to Mike's point, you can look at the words of the former head of the Stanford Internet Observatory saying essentially, well, you guys in Congress, you've run up the legal bills for Stanford, and I don't know if we're going to impose this censorship regime on you in 2024 now. That's sort of their public line anyway. But there's still a ton of other actors out there, even if that particular apparatus isn't functioning this time around. When I testified before Dan Bishop's subcommittee, what I said was there needs to be a mapping effort to look at every single office in the federal government and all of the personnel associated with those offices. And those offices need to be restructured, and no funding needs to go to them so long as they are engaging in the censorship activities, and especially against American citizens, which is the most disturbing thing about all of this, is the directing of these forces that are supposed to keep us safe from foreign actors, turning them on American citizens. And then in addition to the defunding, I would also advocate for criminal penalties for those who engage in these violations on our rights. Because at the end of the day, people don't like to be named and shamed. People certainly don't like to have hanging over their heads the threat of criminal penalties. And those in the censorship industry will say, you're chilling us. But that's the whole point. The point is that you should think more than twice about violating our most imperative God-given rights. When you have justices on the Supreme Court that also take this position, as we saw in oral arguments in the Murthy case of, well, you wouldn't want to silence a government official, but the whole point is that our rights need to be protected. They need to be thinking about that when they're engaging in these sorts of efforts. So defund at the end of the day is obviously vital. It's key to dismantling the entire thing. There were appropriations bills, drafts of appropriations bills in this Congress that did have language about defunding censorship activities. Naturally, of course, they have not made it into the final legislation. And I don't think Congress was willing to go to criminal penalties. There was talk of people losing their jobs in some draft legislation. I think there need to be far greater teeth, because at the end of the day, if no one pays a price other than maybe being dragged before Congress for uncomfortable testimony, you're not going to get a change in behavior. And obviously, they're weaponizing everything against us and throwing people in jail, literally throwing people in jail, convicting people at least, for tweets. There's a censorship to criminalization pipeline, and all we have is oversight. There needs to be something stronger than oversight.
Amen. I think teeth and imposing costs critical. In the last 30 seconds we have, what can everyday Americans do to fight back? What can Moms for Liberty do to fight back? What does, somebody who feels disenfranchised in the middle of the country do against this censorship industrial complex?
Yeah. So, I mean, the number one thing is talk about it, talk about it, talk about it. I mean, don't underestimate the power of one small voice accumulated over millions to do a lot of damage to this system. And that's, the national consciousness raising is often the precursor to any sort of opportunity happening. You want, I just gave the example of members of Congress. The fact is members of Congress didn't leap on this issue until it was already on the tip of everybody's tongues, and they had the semblance of, oh, I'm going to be made a hero by taking on this issue because everyone's already talking about it. Well, that requires you to be already talking about it. We want the speaker battle, for example, to turn on the issue because everyone's talking about it, and that person's ability to deliver on that promise is to be. So I guess that's the number one thing, and the second one is issue by issue. So, for example, on the Moms for Liberty front, I just mentioned media literacy. Media literacy is the censorship industry coming into your schools and grabbing your children by the tonsils and telling them the words they can and can't use, telling them the media sources they can and can't cite, telling them the influencers on social media they can and can't read or subscribe to. It is a total Clockwork Orange program. That's what media literacy is. It is North Korea could only dream of the kind of technological sophistication that media literacy involves. That you are not literate as a child because you read, something coming out of the Heritage Foundation, and that is a fight that is going to happen in every single school. If, for example, as I mentioned, they couldn't win this in a fair fight with legitimacy, so they mandated by law in the states of California, in the states of New York, and the states of Illinois, and this is going to come to purple states, and this is already popping up in red states in little regions everywhere. It's trench warfare. It has to be fought in every county, and it has to be ripped out because again, you don't want professional media literacy teachers. That creates an equity stake in the profession of censorship. Their careers are now going to be staked on. They're not learning, engineering or medical services when they dedicate their lives to that now. And that's every public school, with these media literacy laws. I mean, how many teachers, how many hundreds of thousands of full-time professional teachers is it going to take for that? Get it out of the school, so that's just one issue, for example. But it's issue by issue also because there's a censorship role in every major policy, and in every major policy discussion now on the energy space, on the abortion space, because after the Russiagate predicate was laid down and a simple democracy predicate was used instead, and there was no cost imposed. They said, well, hey, we've basically discovered El Dorado here. This is a golden power. A God button to be able to control discourse on every political issue. And a democracy is about the hearts and minds of the people. If you can simply shut off the ability to influence hearts and minds through censorship, you win by default. You don't need to win by persuasion anymore. So it's issue by issue. Every policy group should be going after the censorship aspects of that thing. And again, one way to find it immediately is by searching for so-called democracy groups and democracy funding in our federal government, that goes to pay for that censorship apparatus.
Okay, so I'm going to interrupt you briefly because they're not giving me the hook just yet. So I'm going to take a little bit of privilege here to challenge you guys before you give your answer on how everyday Americans fight back. So we talk a lot about the cognitive domain and cognitive security. I think that's what you're pretty much alluding to. Yet, I do think that there are genuine national security threats that are permeating this domain, propagated by our enemies, foreign adversaries like China. Look at what the CCP has done with TikTok. They, in their documents, they actually state they want to fight wars in the cognitive domain. They want to use AI to do some of it, and they've begun doing so. We have reporting that they started to try to do the thing that the Russia hoax was accusing everyone of, and actually influence and sow discord in the 2022 elections. So what does that actually look like if there's a legitimate threat? Please don't throw rotten tomatoes at me, but I do think that there are some things that we have to be concerned about when that we have hostile foreign powers, hostile enemies that are actively looking to destroy us and get in the minds of our children to do so from within.
Well, it's obviously you're talking about what happens when you have putative free speech platforms and foreign adversaries exploit them, just like foreign adversaries try to exploit all of our freedoms. obviously, the problem is that our security apparatus has gone so far afield of actually combating the foreign adversaries. Let's start with that. I mean, we have, for example, I've written about this with Al Jazeera and Al Jazeera's sub-entities. Our Department of Justice won't make them comply with FARA. How is that possible? Before we get to what we're going to do with our social media platforms, like, can we not give clearly adversary-backed media entities carte blanche to do as they please and propagate, basically narratives and information meant to undermine America? They have total freedom, though. They act with total impunity. Look, obviously, the TikTok bill itself, we could get into a whole long conversation about that. From my vantage point, it was an asset of the Chinese Communist Party from the start. I am very concerned about the legislation because try as I might to want to believe what the text actually says in letter and spirit, as well as those who are backing it, my huge concern is that, once again, we have a foreign to domestic switcheroo, a legitimate purpose for trying to combat an adversary, but that will ultimately be turned on Americans. And that's why at the end of the day, and this goes to the media literacy, by the way, you need a public and then a leadership that reflects the public that understands that there's a bright line distinction between foreign adversaries and Americans. Speech that is actually speech aimed at truly corrupting and undermining us. And we can look back to how we dealt with it, by the way, during the Cold War. And then speech that is actually domestic speech from domestic speakers that we may disagree with and hate and find odious and toxic, but that we have to tolerate because that's the price of living in an actual free society. But I think we're so far from that at this point. And our leadership is so in this worldview of your dissent is a danger to my power, and I'm going to recharacterize it as a threat to national security or public health or the environment or polluting the minds of young children, and consequently use that as a pretext to go after people who I disagree with. We're so far from that I think the threats you're talking about, yes, there are real threats, but ultimately, if you don't have a change in leadership, which requires a change in the public, which is precisely why the American Federation for Teachers works with NewsGuard to control media literacy education, ultimately that's where it starts, obviously in families and in our schools. And that's going to require a generational sea change that we're obviously far from today.
Agree on the sea change. I mean, I do think, especially when it comes to the TikTok policies, we've been working on that for almost 5 years now. And when things actually were legitimate and we were fighting foreign adversaries, and I think it's just the bare minimum we can do to contest a hostile enemy that is very, very insidious. Last thing, I'm sorry for dominating the stage right now, but last thing, what can everyday Americans do to contest this industrial complex?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, again, talking about it, as I mentioned before, is the number one thing you can do in creating that enticement for folks to take action. But I would also just piggyback on what Ben said here, which is no proxies. The reason that this censorship infrastructure was able to be established and laundered in by the national security state in the first place was because the blob is in the middle of an in-process operation to seize Eurasia from Russia. This is something that's been going on for decades, and Trumpism was deemed to be a proxy. Therefore, by using this foreign predicate, you could say, well, hey, if Trump wants a détente with Russia, after all these sanctions that we put on them after the Crimea annexation in 2014, if Trump wants neutrality with Russia, or if Marine Le Pen in France wants neutrality with Russia, or if the AfD party in Germany wants a gas pipeline with Russia in Germany, or if the Spanish Vox party wants neutrality with Russia, every single one of those groups, just because of what their own citizens want to do foreign policy wise vis-a-vis another country, will be categorized as a proxy force for Russia, and that apparatus will be used. So I understand. I totally agree the point about, and if you actually have a hard forensic receipt, they didn't have that with RussiaGate, but it's a proxy war, and if you can simply just draw the line at no proxies, then that would be the protection, as I see.